Good afternoon, good night, good morning. Thank you for attending. So I want to read a section of my essay from the book in the hopes that it gives some context to the rest of the day. As Juliet mentioned, the book is a result. Well, one way to tell the story where this book starts is from the conference that was held in 2019 in May, a two-day conference or 15 speakers, and those papers that were delivered over those 2 days produced the backbone for this project. And then during COVID and all that fun stuff, the project ballooned into 41 essays. I didn't think that 15 essays sketched out a broad enough story. That story is the history of graphic design pedagogy after the Bauhaus, so roughly 1995, which gets us to Ulm, before the internet, which is 1995, roughly. So here, the history of graphic. Okay, so there's the conference. This essay is called "The History of Graphic Design Pedagogy," or so they tell me. History of Graphic Design Pedagogy begins with a statement by Catherine McCoy, with whom I studied while at Cranbrook Academy of Art in the mid-1990s. I do not recall exactly when Kathy made the statement, but it would have been a few years after graduate school when I was establishing my studio practice and teaching at Art Center, CalArts, and Otis. I am certain it was communicated over the phone when I asked for teaching advice. Kathy said, "Graphic design moves from a professional practice to a discipline when design writes its own histories and theories." Over the years, as I lived in Los Angeles and then in San Francisco, I consider the historicity of her pronouncement, even as the parlance shifted from that of LA Valley girls to that of Silicon Valley programmers, from dude, that is totally awesome, to design thinking, interdisciplinarity, and problem solving. I frequently toyed with the terms by which we describe design, especially as they relate to McCoy's statement on the discipline of graphic design. Today, when design calls for more inter, trans, and multidisciplinary strategies, I continue to explore when and if graphic design was, is, or could become a discipline. Spurred on by this phone call and by years of teaching, I set out to understand how we tell these stories and how we transmit this history to our students. The following then is structured as a conversation between myself and my peers. As Kathy explained in one of our many follow-up conversations, when professional practice led education, graphic design was a professional orientation at best. When graphic design education started breaking new ground, it became more like a discipline. The first part of our history, there was the service industry, also called commercial art. The sense graphic design professionalism arrived in the early to mid 60s when it split from advertising with the rise of corporate identity. That lasted to the late 60s and early 70s before education started taking the ascendancy. And I do think there was at least a 10-year period where design had become a profession, where we left behind the service to industry model. At that point, design moves into a disciplinary direction. But what does the term discipline mean in light of graphic design history? And what does discipline mean relative to the practice of reading as well as writing? In any discussion of discipline, references to Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, the Birth of Prisons is unavoidable. The French title of the book telegraphs the interests of surveillance in the notion of disciplinarity, the sense of watching and being watched, and the sense of control that stems from both. Foucault argues for the Foucault argues for the historical rise of what he will call disciplinarity or control society, namely, how populations are managed within the modern West. Foucault describes changes in the penal system in Western society after the democratic revolutions of the 18th century, from the mode of punishment related to the power of the sovereign, a spectacle for all the subjects, to the forms of control involving self-policing, self-regulation, and the internalization of disciplinary power. The classic example of a modern discipline is that of the panoptic prison, where guards were stationed in the central watchtower. The tower's design rendered the presence of the guards invisible. They can at any time observe and regulate the actions of the prisoners from within the centralized structure. Because the prisoners never knew when they were being observed, they internalized the power dynamics and assumed that they are always being watched. Foucault provides the fundamental statement on control society, a useful way of thinking about how we self-regulate within our own disciplinary homes. But there are far less theoretical ways to approach the question of design discipline. The contemporary form of disciplinary control comes to us by way of Yelp or other user-generated platforms in the form of reviews, rank lists, judgment of our peers and audiences. The scrutiny of other disciplines keeps us in order. The scrutiny of the institution produces discipline. To return to McCoy's statement, one could say, as designers construct their histories and theories, they in turn discipline themselves. But the term discipline need not be punitive. It can also be a shared commitment. Deborah Littlejohn draws a distinction between practice and discipline with recourse to Thomas Kuhn by suggesting that a discipline is a set of shared beliefs, values, and techniques. In a footnote to her dissertation, Building a Theory of Relations Among Academic Culture, Professional Identity, and the Design of Teaching, in the Design of the Teaching Environment, she states, practice refers to a design industry and the activities associated with professional services. In a second sense, practice is a coordinated effort formed around a particular activity, as in the carrying out of some action. A discipline is defined by a set of shared commitments, patterns of thinking and behaviors common to an academic community in a given field. Typically, one would start the history of graphic design pedagogy with the Bauhaus, because those who attended the school were thought to have held a set of shared practices and commitments. But there has been extensive research in this field. But as Argentine painter Thomas Maldonado explained in Ulm Journal 8-9 in 1963, the Bauhaus didactics, particularly the preliminary course, was a question of exaltation of expression, intuition, and action. Above all, learning by doing. But this educational philosophy is in crisis. It is incapable of assimilating to new types of relationships between theory and practice, engendered by the most recent scientific developments. We know now that theory must be impregnated with practice, practice with theory. It is impossible to act today without knowledge or to know without doing. Following Maldonado, I situate the historical concerns of the study in a post-war moment in which theory was as important as practice, the period after the Bauhaus, as the title makes clear. The pedagogy of the Ulm School of Design, among the most important post-Bauhaus design programs, would become instrumental in disseminating its ideas within the US and internationally after the war. Ulm was established in 1950 with private funds of Ingrid Scholl as a memorial of sorts to her brother and sister who were murdered by the Nazis in 1943. Additional funding came from American foundations, a Cold War narrative in the making, no doubt. Bill Max, an alum of the Bauhaus, was appointed the first director of Ulm, which opened its doors to students in 1955 and closed in 1968. The mission statement of the school appears in the first Ulm Journal of October 1958. Ulm educates specialists for two different tasks of our technical civilization. Number one, this is from the journal. Number one, the design of industrial products. Number two, the design of visual and verbal means of communication. The school thus educates designers for the production of consumer goods, for consumer goods industries, as well as for present-day means of communication, press, film, broadcasting, television, and advertising. The designers must have at their disposal the technological and scientific knowledge necessary for collaboration in industry today. Classes offered in the foundation course included a range of topics including methodology, sociology, perception theory, cultural history of the 20th century, and mathematics, physics, and chemistry. In the visual communications department, classes were taught on technologies of typesetting, process reproduction, printing and paper, semiotics, a history of typography, exhibition design and film, theory of science, and optional courses in operational research. What this list of course offerings demonstrates is a radical shift away from the sense-based craft pedagogy of the Bauhaus toward a pedagogy based on science, history, philosophy, and modern production technologies. The shift was in part due to the influence of Maldonado. In the second issue of Ulm, 1958, the painter wrote, "The ideas which supply the basis for what might be called the Bauhaus ideology are today, a quarter of a century after that institution closed, difficult to translate into the language of our present-day preoccupations. Furthermore, some of these ideas must now be refuted with the greatest vehemence as well as with the greatest objectivity." In 2012, Maldonado elaborates, we were living in another time. There was the onset of the conflict in which young professors understood that it was no longer possible to continue with Bauhaus traditions. Because Max Bill proposed the same exercises that they did at the Bauhaus, it was a clear repetition of the same ideas. It was a difficult conflict to manage because there were bills. Someone wants to get in 1 second. How do I do it? I don't have a mouse. How is this possible? No. Oh. Enable. This. So in 2021, Maldonado elaborates, we were living in another time. There was the onset of a conflict in which young professors understood it was no longer possible to continue with Bauhaus traditions because Max Bill proposed the same exercises they did at the Bauhaus. It was a near repetition of the same ideas. It was a difficult conflict to manage because there were Bill's ideological characteristics and ours, and the conflict grew worse with time. I'm talking about 1955. For example, the Bauhaus was known for not having a library. There was distrust that all that could be considered philosophical and scientific to be considered philosophical and scientific literary culture. To further hone in on Ulm's pedagogical concerns, Consider the position of Guy Bonsepe, who studied at Ulm in the information department from 1955 to 1958 and taught there from 1963 until the school's closing. The Invisible Facets of Ulm is the title of a lecture Bonsepe redrafted as an essay for Design Issues the summer of 1995, where he elaborated on the histories and influences of Ulm. Bonsepe here. Design opposes the cognitive ideal and the understanding of practices in universities. Design opposes the interpolation of technology prevailing in technical institutions. Design opposes the ideal of aesthetic experiences of artistic institutions. Bonsepe goes on to state, design has no place in any of these institutions, and if it did, it would just be tolerated as a foreign body. Bonsepe addresses a problem critical to my project with the metaphor of design as a foreign body. His statement implicitly complicates McCoy's insistence that graphic design has or even could satisfy the conditions of disciplinarity. Bonsepe tells us that design as it relates to the academy produces a number of structural discontinuities. The academy is not capable of providing an institutional home for design within either the sciences or the arts. If for Deb Littlejohn, design is pre-disciplinary, for Bonsepe, it is anti-disciplinary by default. Bonsepe offers some historical remedies for the formation of design discourse and its bearings on design education and professional practice. Ulm reclaimed and instituted design as an autonomous discipline, which couldn't be allowed to serve as an agency for other disciplines. Thus, it was neither an appendage of nor a supplement to mechanical engineering or submissive to marketing, nor a variant of fine arts in the form of applied arts, nor a subcategory of architecture. Design is neither art nor technology nor science, since none of these realms of knowledge provides the distinctions necessary to grasp the concept of design. Ulm used education with its programmatic disposition to build a bridge to the scientific disciplines. Ulm broke with the long tradition of the skill-oriented institutional program of the craft school. Design was demystified and treated as a teachable and learnable discipline with methods whose applications made superfluous the recurrent communication between master and student through osmosis. Putting a finer point on Littlejohn's characterization of design as pre-disciplinary, Bonsepe, in a somewhat exaggerated tone, continues, design is in its prehistoric stages, and we find ourselves at a historical moment in relationship to the advent of universal digitization. For the purposes of this project, we might replace the notion of writing with writing our own histories to reading them, and instead chart the literature that was taken up by generations of graphic designers after the Bauhaus. Rephrasing McCoy's statement, one could say, graphic design moves from a professional practice to discipline when design reads its histories and theories. We start with Bonsepe's recollection of the Ulm Library. The list of books held in the small Ulm Library in the 1950s included the first Amsterdam edition of Horkheim and Adorno's Dialectic of the Enlightenment, the first two editions of Benjamin's writings, and 2 volumes of Darcy Thompson's groundbreaking work on growth and form. The books Bonsepe says were noticeably absent are equally interesting, especially considering the date, 1968, when in major metropolitan areas around the globe, areas of concentrated intellectual and labor union activity were ablaze in fervent protest by those who were demanding the halting of war and the liberation of the underserved global masses. Nor would Derrida's writings have found much approval at Ulm, although they certainly would have been discussed had they been better known before 1968. Postmodernism, which Lyotard aptly identified as the quote loss of faith in meta-narratives, also didn't coincide with Ulm's program. It is safe to say, based on the above, that von Seppe, at least in the mid-1990s when the statement was penned, is a proponent of master narratives. Sheila de Bretteville was in Italy working at a pivotal moment of 1968. The formation of her political views was constructed in large degree by the actions on the streets of Europe and the books she was reading. De Bretteville recalls, anyone who lived through the prior 2 years was not untouched by the civil rights movement, the revolution in Paris. I was fascinated with the revolution in May in Paris and the streets and the graphic design output at the time. I was reading Franz Fanon and Pablo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. These books and the Times had a huge impact on me when I began to teach, because from Freire, the whole idea that the role of the teacher is to help the student become themselves. I took it to heart. Certainly, Franz Fanon's attitude toward institutionalized racism was part of what was installed in me, in my sensibility. It just had a big effect on the way I thought about people and how I cared about individuals. And certainly Freire gave me a way of teaching that every student has a body of knowledge of their own that they bring. Now let us compare the Ulm reading list to that of Jeffrey Keedy. Keedy and what Keedy has to say about his reading habits in the early 80s. Geoff Keedy plays a significant role in any narration of contemporary design history, particularly related to the institutionalizing impact of the act of reading on design discourse. Following is an excerpt from a conversation I had with Keedy in 2016 about what he was reading as a graduate student and how reading influences pedagogical formation as a young teacher. This is Keedy. It wasn't until 1984, my first year at Cranbrook, when I started reading the journal Visible Language, and Tom Ockersey, who had published all the stuff about semiotics. The Rhode Island School of Design was big into semiotics. I remember that was the current academic material that was available. That was the most theory-ish theory. It was straight Charles Peirce, The Theory of the Sign. I remember starting off with that, reading it, thinking, okay, I guess this stuff makes some sense, and the science of signs, but it also seemed fairly patched together and therefore not very interesting. Simultaneously to that, all the deconstruction hit seemingly everywhere in art and architecture. Everyone started being interested in the French material. Then I ask, the story I heard is that at Cranbrook, you were hanging out with architecture students and cherry picking their readings. Is this true? Keedy replies, partially. Actually, it was the presence of Daniel Libeskind, head of architecture department. He was a big influence. He brought all these people in. Zaha Hadid came in. All the big name architects came through. Also, some art critics and art theory people visited. So it was in the air, but not for the graphic design people. My first year at Cranbrook, I met Hani Rashid, a student in architecture. We would talk, and then I would hang out in the architecture department. Then there was an industrial design student named Alan Cooper. He read a lot. He started being interested in theory. Also, since we were right next to Ann Arbor, I used to go over to the Borders books, and there was this whole row, basically a section in the bookstore that contained all the French stuff, including Derrida and semiotics. The University of Michigan's humanities programs were starting to pick all that stuff up. And I was like, oh, who is this Roland Barthes? It was picking up steam. It was big. It was the thing. And I asked, you brought these books and their influences into the studio, and from there, they found their way into form? Katie responds, the reason I'm mentioning Tomocracy and visible language is that the post-structuralist stuff made more sense to me. It just picked up and pushed further the theory that was most influential at the time. In the 70s, it was about design methodologies and semiotics and rhetoric. Rhetoric was always a big thing with Tomocracy. And so if you were there and exposed to all the more advanced psychoanalytical influenced notions of language that they were getting from the French writers, it just made sense to me and felt relevant at the time. Peirce seemed too structuralist and out of date. Everyone realized, wait a minute, look at what Derrida has to say about how language works, how language is basically used as a cultural construct. Immediately I thought, gosh, that makes a ton of sense for graphic design, because that's what we are doing. We're making cultural constructs. It was a big deal. Although there was a whole bunch of people who hated it, others thought it was great. It was a certain moment when there was energy in thinking and critical thinking in theory. Because I was young and dumb, I naively thought it was that this was what design really needed to help make it and establish it as a cultural practice, not just a bunch of hacks that help people get things printed and sold. I thought this theory is a thing that will cement it and make it part of a broader cultural practice. I thought this was going to catch on. For a while, it was part of the fight of design, is not just greasing the wheels of capitalism with style and taste, but is being a cultural practice. Everyone accepts that now. The fight has been won. Design as a cultural practice or as an art practice is now accepted, which in my undergraduate days was not the case. Everyone had that Paul Wren mentality. This is not art. Don't think you're an artist, honey. Thanks.